Conscience in Action, Part 2. In 2007, the AACE, the Association of Christadelphian Ecclesias, published a book entitled Conscience in Action, the Experience of Conscientious Objection in Australia. The book is both descriptive but exhortational, outlining the reasons for the principled stand and how that was enacted by brethren and sisters down through the years. Information has been collected from a number of sources, including, and most importantly in the case of this podcast, accounts of personal experiences that have been recorded. And now, nearly 20 years on, many of these brothers and sisters have subsequently fallen asleep in the Lord, which makes these recordings a treasured resource indeed. The recordings are available with the book, but we reproduce them here for convenience and for those who don't have a copy of the book. But we do encourage you to get a copy. It's available very easily on the website aace.info. This is part 2, continuing with experiences from the Second World War. Brother Ted Smith shares his experiences from World War II.
It was during the war years of 1940 I was called up for military service. Because I wasn't in the truth at the time, I had no objection to taking the oath of allegiance to serve King and country. I was allotted to the 3rd Light Horse Brigade, which was attached to the Signal Corps, and was sent to Mount Gambier for 3 months to do our training. After this, we were given 3 months' leave, and then another call-up, and it was during these 3 months' leave I was learning the truth, and eventually baptised by Brother Charlie Briggs in the Adelaide Ecclesia. Brother Gordon Walker, who was recorder at this time, suggested I make a written application to the Army headquarters to be enrolled as a conscientious objector. This was done, and the reply there was no provision made for conscientious objectors. Soon after, I was summoned to appear before Judge in the Hindmarsh Police Court to state my case along with 20 or 30 other brethren. Most received full exemption. 3 to 4 had to go up north to burn charcoal. I was ordered non-combatant duties in the army again, but an appeal was made and I had to appear before the judge in the Adelaide court. The appeal was dismissed and I was informed to make myself ready for another call-up. Some months passed by until a sergeant delivered an order one Sunday afternoon, just as we were going to Sunday school, to report to the Alberton Drill Hall. After working all night, the last thing I wanted to hear was orders coming from Captain Mitchell after waiting around for an hour at the Alberton Drill Hall. I was then taken up to Keswick Army headquarters. After 2 to 3 hours wait again, I was taken over to Wavell headquarters, and after lunch I was told by a sergeant to get undressed and put on the army uniform. Of course I refused, and a lieutenant came in on the scene and asked the sergeant what all the fuss was about. He said, "This man won't put on the uniform." "Oh," he said, "won't he? We'll get him surrounded by bayonets and we'll make him put it on." But the idea was squashed, and he said, "Better still, we'll have a court-martial." Then the lieutenant said to me, "Would you like to have it now or later?" I said, "Have it now and get it over and done with." Within minutes, they had 3 or 4 tables up, and majors, captains, lieutenants and sergeants running around as if the sky was going to fall. Then Captain Dennis told me to stand and face them. and asked me, do I plead guilty or not, for refusing to put the army uniform on. I said, guilty. They asked why. I said, since I last put the uniform on, I have been baptised in 1941. I have given my allegiance to Christ. They said, but you have given your allegiance to the Queen. I said, yes, sir, but my allegiance to Christ is far more important. After this, they said, take him away and lock him up in the Wavell jail. I was there until 9 p.m. and then I was told to go home and go back to work because they had received my application for exemption. I received notice to hold myself ready to go into camp again as application for exemption had been refused. Within a couple of days I was back there again and they said, your application has been refused. You will now be taken down to the Adelaide jail. On arrival, I was taken into the QM store and told again to put on the uniform, which I refused to do, and I was suddenly given a slap across the face. I felt like saying, God shall smite thee, thou whited sepulchre, but I had to use a bit of discretion. I was then given 2 blankets and the sergeant took me down to a cell and he said to me to leave the blankets outside because you won't get them tonight. He then locked me in and left. Within half an hour, another sergeant came and unlocked the door and said, are these your blankets? I said, yes. He said, come out and get them because we are having a film here tonight and we don't want them in the way. Once again, the ways of providence rules. After staying a few days in the Adelaide jail and early one morning, about 20 of us or more were taken down to the Adelaide railway station in the back of a truck to board a train to be taken up to the Gladstone jail. Even though no one knew where we were going, after a hot journey, we arrived at Gladstone approximately 2 p.m. We all boarded another truck and hurriedly taken around to the jail. After a heap of red tape, we were taken to our cells and we could hear this constant yelling out from sergeant in the parade ground. Left, right, about turn, on the double. I said to one of the porters, what's going on out there? He said, that's all right, mate, you'll be out there tomorrow. And sure enough, that's where we all finished up. Next day, after a restless night on a piece of timber, approximately 30 inches wide and 6 feet long, my first day in Gladstone prison, our first duty was to empty the night bucket and wash and shave, pack our 2 blankets into a knapsack and go on parade, and then line up for breakfast. But who could eat burnt porridge in such circumstances? We were then ordered back into our cells to put on our knapsacks and marched out into the parade ground to receive a little pep talk. And that was to let us know it was a military prison. And so long as we were there, we were going to do as we were told. 4 sergeants in charge of about 50 men. We had to march around this parade ground, approximately 1 acre in size, from approximately 9 a.m. to 12 noon, and only one break while these sergeants occupied. Lunchtime didn't come quick enough. At approximately 2 p.m. we were marched outside again. This sergeant attitude was anything but human. We had big army boots on and we marched all day around this big parade ground, and my feet could hardly carry my body around. They ached, and big blisters were forming. I was starting to wonder if the truth was all worth it. However, I prayed hard to our Heavenly Father, and He soon found a way out, because He said we would not be tried more than we are able to bear. And the medical officer was due in a day or two, and if I had any complaints I would go and see him, which I did. And when he seen my feet, his temper was aroused, and he went straight into the headquarters to see the captain. Told him I wasn't to march any more, but to go on light duties until my feet were healed up. Some 2 or 3 days locked up in my cell. Then I was transferred to the kitchen to peel potatoes and work in the garden. The ways of providence working again. I also had visitors on one occasion, my mother and father, my wife and brother Percy Mansfield and his father. Brother Jim Mansfield Sr., who also brought me up some fruit and sweets. However, I wasn't allowed to have any because the sergeant who was standing guard said so. But I received a large amount of mail from our brothers and sisters, all of which was censored. Well, the time came for us to catch the train back to Adelaide, and we were all given leave passes for the weekend. On the Sunday morning, I went to the memorial meeting in Adelaide and was announced by the recording brother, who said I had just been released from the Gladstone jail. A brother came up to me and spoke after the meeting for a while. His brother came up to us and said, "Come away from that man. He has been in jail." Well, on the Monday I had to report to Wavell headquarters again, only to receive another leave pass for a week. Then to report back again for another leave pass for a fortnight, and so on. Each leave pass got longer until I got my discharge, approximately 2 years from when I was called up. I've mainly written this paper for the young people because they may not have known what conscientious objection is all about. Who knows what conscientious means? Conscientious objection, that is, we don't bear arms to fight. We don't bear a grudge against our brethren and sisters. We obey the 10 Commandments, and we honour our mother and father, that our days may be long on the earth. We have no part with the Army, Navy, Air Force or Police Force. We know they are a necessary people we have in this godless age, but we obey the laws of the land until it conflicts with the laws of Christ. Then we must draw the line, whatever else happens.
One set of young Christadelphians from Sydney, Ken, Alan and John Hardy, were all sentenced in February 1943 to 3 months' jail for refusing to take the oath. John Hardy recounts his personal experiences and says they were taken from Campbelltown to Parramatta in a train, handcuffed together. Parramatta prison was mostly for the more hardened criminals, and the conscientious objectors spent some weeks alongside these prisoners. The Ecclesia asked for them to be moved from Parramatta, and they were allocated to the Emu Plains prison farm via Long Bay Jail in high security. They were treated well in Emu Plains and were given visiting hours once per week.
Well, the initial contact that we had was we had a letter from the Department of Army requiring us to report at the local drill hall for medical examination, which we went and objected to being medically examined. not for any other reason other than it's the first step in becoming a member of the military forces. We told the magistrate, or told the, what was his name, Major Levy, we didn't object to being examined by a doctor for any reason at all other than to become a member eligible for the military forces. So that was their first approach to the army. So in process of time we had a number of calls from them to report back again and so forth. And eventually we were called upon to submit to the magistrate at the Court of Petty Sessions in Parramatta. We had, prior to this, lodged a form to be released from anything to do with the military services and asked for unconditional remission from those services. Went to the Parramatta Court, being only youngsters at that time, 18 and 19 and 20. He said, well, the term in the army, do you boys the world of good? So we didn't do any good there. From then on, we registered to come before a judge, Judge Clancy as it was, as an appeal to the original, which took place some many months afterwards. In the meantime, we were working down in the Robertson area on dairy farms, and so again we were conscripted to, we were sentenced to a prison. And they took us in public transport in a train from Campbelltown to Parramatta, handcuffed together. We were locked up in Parramatta in the high security section, 6th wing. We were there amongst prisoners who were lifers, who were murderers, and who had committed all sorts of criminal things to receive the penalties that they were having. We were there for a number of weeks, and our parents and the Ecclesia had written to the army and to members of Parliament requesting that we should be moved from that environment, and they were told, well, they will be moved to Emu Plains Prison Farm. But in the meantime, they sent us to Long Bay Jail, again in high security. We were there for a number of weeks, and finally we were sent to Emu Plains Prison Farm. Emu Plains Prison Farm was not bad. We were working on the dairy there. We were given visiting hours on the weekend where we could meet our relations, parents and members of the Ecclesia on the lawn section. And so that went on all right. But in the meantime, there were a number of letters written to and fro by members of the Ecclesia and our parents asking that we should be released before Christmas. And they said by a reasonable amount of remission time that we would be released before Christmas, even though our time for release was about the 24th or the 25th of January. Eventually we were released. Now, getting back to the court proceedings, which I suppose is a matter of interest as to what we did and how we did it. When we came up against Judge Clancy, he had a barrister who had been a member of a church, and I don't know what church it was, but he was very familiar with his Bible. He asked us a number of questions, and we turned up our Bible and answered them, what we thought was quite adequately. And he says, could I have a look at your Bible? And it was passed across to him. He says, oh, he said, you've got some colours marked in here. What are they marked for? I said, well, they're scriptures which we would like to remember because they're appropriate to our stand in what we call the truth. Oh, he said, look, he said, can I have a look at your Bible? I said, yes, by all means. He said, I'll pass my Bible over to you, which was a King James Bible. And he said, you'll be familiar with that. So he said, I'll ask you some questions about various things. He did. He asked us a number of questions about various things, turned up the scriptures, and they weren't there. The proof that we were looking for wasn't in his Bible. He had torn out pages. And that happened in a number of cases through. And so we couldn't get over that. As much as we could memorise the proof that we wanted, he could see that it was in the Bible, in our Bible, that he had. That was one of the nasty experiences that we had. A number of things happened to us during that time. Whilst we were in prison, we were treated reasonably well, excepting my cousin. He was fair-headed and a bit better looking than myself and my brother. And in the Parramatta jail, they had work areas. They had a plumber's shop and a painter shop and a carpenter shop. His carpenters got him, took him down and hid him in a coffin. And they're going to go to town on him that night. But in roll call he was missing, and an extensive search was made, and they did locate him prior to evening. Well, they had access to all sorts of things. They had access to our Sunday school record. They had access to our baptism. They had access to our attendance at midweek classes and Saturday class and Sunday meetings. So you've got to be particularly careful what you do these days, because the big brother upstairs there is watching everybody, and he knows exactly what you're doing if he wants to know. We went through a number of evenings of Christ and War evenings, and we went through mock trials there, which we thought was quite good, and we thought, well, this is good, we're going to be able to handle ourselves fairly well. But when you come into a court again, and you're only in your late teens or early 20s, there's a heck of a lot of emotion there that comes up that's not in amongst your own fellows, and it was very, very difficult. But in the court they gave us time, and they realised that we were to some degree emotionally upset. They offered us water to sort of cool us down, offered us time to sort of regain our composure again. But it was fairly good. We were asked particularly questions as to why you would not be medically examined, and we said, well, we're not prepared to take the first step into going into the army. There were Jehovah's Witnesses, for instance. They were medically examined, but they would not take the oath. So we were determined not to take one step in their direction at all. It worked out in our favour to do this, because failing to be medically examined, the penalty was 3 months in prison. Failing not to take the oath was a penalty of 6 months. So whereas we were in for 3 months, the Jehovah's Witnesses were in for 6 months and called upon again to attend courts. Well, we were never called upon after we were released to attend court again. We told them that we were prepared to work on the land, but having nothing to do whatsoever with the military service. And it was said, well, you're going to milk cows, and the milk could be going to the army camp. Well, we said, we don't know what the milk's going to, where it's going to be distributed. It's going to go to the milk factory, to the cheese factory to make cheese and so forth. And what happened to it from then on was not our concern, but we were prepared to do farm work under civil control, but not under military control at all. In hindsight, they could see that we were determined in our own lives not to become involved whatsoever, even though we weren't granted exemption.
The ongoing challenge for Christadelphians in Australia was that the Act had no provision for conscientious objection to non-combatant duties, and there was no provision initially for alternative work. And another problem was that while the Act allowed for conscientious objection, there was no provision available to register as an objector. And so the only alternative was that young men had to avoid completing the registration form and write a letter. At a later stage, a registration form for conscientious objection would be developed, and some guidance would be given by the government on how to complete it. Meanwhile, some ecclesias instructed their members to avoid completing the registration or enrolment form altogether, whilst others went about and completed the form and opted out of the process later. The enlistment procedure was supposed to be that a registration form be completed, and the young man would then be called to have a medical examination and be called upon to take the oath of allegiance. At the same time as refusing to take an oath, he would indicate his wish to be a conscientious objector. Avoidance of completing the registration form in the first place meant that the young man would be disobeying a civil requirement and would be summoned to appear before a civil court. If the registration form was completed, the young man would then be under the control of the military and be subject to military justice. It was noted that the penalty for civil disobedience was much less severe than military penalties. You can see the challenge that our brethren and sisters had during these early periods of the Second World War. Brother John Clark tells of his personal experiences. John was called up even though he was in an industry that was protected. By November 1942, he was directed by Manpower to go into the Wadigan State Forest with other conscientious objectors. John was fortunate in that he was with 6 other Christadelphians during this time.
In the period leading up to the outbreak of war, I was working in various country areas and had no connection at all with any ecclesia, being unbaptised at that time. When the regulations requiring enrolment were first published, there was a clause in the notices that people who lived more than 5 miles from an army area office did not require to register. My work in Orange was nearly finished and I expected to return to my home on the outskirts of Sydney, which was more than 5 miles from the nearest registry office. I did nothing at all about registry. Then one day I was approached by an army officer in Orange who inquired as to my age and whether I had registered or not. However, instead of returning to Sydney, I then moved to Mildura, approximately 30 miles from Orange. So I advised the officer in Orange accordingly, and again was told to let him know when I moved on. It would have been probably about May 1941 when my work in Mildura completed. I then returned to Sydney, and as the 5-mile exemption had more or less disappeared by that time, I then contacted the area office in Parramatta, but was told that as I didn't know just what to do with me, I just needed to keep in touch until I was further advised. Following my return to Sydney, I resumed contact with the Ecclesia at Petersham in Sydney, where I had been a member of the Sunday school and youth group while moving to the country. And only at that time that I had become baptised and involved in the various proceedings which are taking place to support young brethren regarding their military service. It was obvious that there were differences of opinion as to procedures that should be followed. Some brethren advocated that one should go for their medical examination, and if found to be unfit, that was God's blessing upon them. They were no longer required to be involved. Others said that we should take a stand no matter what our situation was. We should lodge our objections to any form of military service, and also we should not complete any of the enrolment forms as they took the format of an application to join the army. By this time, I had moved my residence to Auburn, which then caused me to transfer to the Granville Army area. It was from that area I received a call-up for medical examination, having merely provided them with details of my age, place of birth, and all the other information they wanted. This was done in the form of a letter, not on the army form. I had my medical examination and was pronounced fit, and then, as were other young brethren at the time, was subjected to verbal abuse and ridicule in front of the quite considerable number of other young men who were there for medical examination and subsequent induction into the army. However, as they still had no specific instruction as to what to do with people claiming to be conscientious objectors, I again was merely told to keep them posted of any changes in the dress. It was probably about the middle of 1942 when, following the issuing of the regulations specifically referring to conscientious objectors and both combatant and non-combatant service, that I completed the necessary documentation applying for exemption in accordance with these regulations. By this time, I was married and my wife and I were living in Manly, which put me in a different area again. So that finally, when I received notice that my case would be heard, this was at the Manly Courthouse. There were no special sessions, conscientious objectors. As with all those sort of things, no matter how many cases were listed to be heard on a particular day, everyone was told to report at 10 a.m. So a brother who had come along to support me, an older brother, we did arrive, but it was not till well after lunch that our case was heard, after all sorts of things from using water in a manner not permitted, initial rape charges and similar things were heard by the same magistrate. At the hearing, the local area officer was there together with another army officer from their legal department, and we were required to answer various questions about not only our beliefs, but referring to portions of scripture which they quoted, saying one that there were magistrates and not of a king and things like that. However, at the end of the hearing, the magistrate advised me that I would be registered as an objector, conditional upon my undertaking work of national importance, or whatever the phraseology was that appeared in the regulations. Being engaged in the transport industry, I was now doing work which was exempt from military call-up. In November of 1942, I received advice from the Department of Manpower that I was to report to them to perform work in the Forestry Commission of New South Wales. My employer protested vigorously to the Manpower authorities, but they insisted that as I had been registered as an objector, they had no option other than to apply those regulations to me. And I was instructed to be a central station at a particular time and date in order, with other objectors, to be transported to the Watagan State Forest, the nearest railway station being Morisset. There were approximately 20 of us in the group, of which the Christadelphians were the most numerous, 7 of us altogether. The only other group really being the Jehovah's Witnesses, of which there were 5. There were 2 young men who were members of a church called the Philadelphians that I had never heard of before nor since. The others were belonging to various churches and were pacifists, more on moral than religious grounds. However, we had all been registered and we were consigned to the Watagan State Forest. We arrived at Morisset and were met there by forestry officials, together with a truck to which we were loaded, and after purchasing food supplies, we were taken up into the forest where a camp had been prepared for our living quarters. The project in which we were to be engaged was already in progress and consisted of the building of a road through the Watagan and Olney state forests for the purpose of opening up the forest to obtain timber therefrom. The work was largely of a labouring type, some being involved in digging drains, digging earth out, and cutting around the roots of trees to be felled. 1 or 2 of us worked for a while with the survey gang, and occasionally we might be working with the bulldozer. helping to attach the horses to the trees for the bulldozer to fell them. There was already a group of regular forestry workers in their own camp with whom we were obliged to work. And as we found the conditions which they had negotiated for themselves were to apply to us, and in this we were well blessed in many ways. Most of these men, who were all much older than us, came from the Bulladoola area, and they had an arrangement whereby they were able to return home each weekend, and the total number of 44 hours per week, which then applied, was worked between late morning on a Monday and midday on Friday to enable them to return home. Returning home each weekend, we were all loaded on the forestry truck and taken down initially to the Morisset railway station. As the road progressed, we were taken to Cessnock, but this enabled us to return home to our families. The 7 Christadelphians were all married other than Jimmy McClure. In my own case, I was released from the forest much earlier than the rest of the brethren. I had been in the forest about 5 months when our first child was born. After about a year, I was released from the forest on compassionate grounds and allowed to return to Sydney. This didn't result from anything that we had brought up, but the family doctor, my wife's family doctor who was caring for her, he got in touch with the manpower department and objected strongly to me being away in the forest to her health and the baby's health being as it was. And when this was ignored, he went personally to the manpower department in Martin Place, Sydney, and caused such a stir that I got a telegram in the forest brought up by a postman on horseback telling me to return to Sydney immediately. Following my return to Sydney, the manpower authorities sent me to Arnott's Biscuit Factory. There were already 3 brethren working there, 2 probably 10, 15 years or more older than myself, who had been caught up in later army call-ups as they lifted the age for people to be enrolled, and a younger brother who had a health problem which prevented him doing any work. I am very conscious of the fact that I was well cared for and well blessed by our Heavenly Father. The time I spent in the forest, what a blessing it was to be with the other brethren. We were able to support one another in many ways. We used to gather together each evening, do the daily readings, discuss chapters and similar things.
From page 78 of the book, the frustration in negotiations continued. A frustration became evident in the correspondence between Francis and the Commonwealth Government was that the issues raised were being shunted between various ministries and departments, and that considerable time elapsed between any communications. The situation became more urgent as time went on because a number of young men were left in limbo with regards to their status, and at the same letter to the Minister of Defence, Francis indicated that there were 2 men whose applications for registration as conscientious objectors were rejected by an area officer and who had appealed to the decision. The clerk of the court indicated that no date had been set for the appeal because no instructions had been provided by the government on the implementation of the Act or its statutory rules. Brother Kevin Dawes shares his experiences from World War II.
Yes, well, my father worked in the coal mines, which was a reserved occupation, so he wouldn't be called up, and nevertheless, when the brethren there, it was only a small ecclesia, when the brethren did apply for exemption, conscientious objection, he thought he ought to be with them, so he applied also. When the court cases were finished and were being reported, he got a very bad press, sort of singled out as a very bad press because it was suggested in the paper that here was a man who wanted two strings to his bow. He wasn't content with being in a reserved occupation, but if he were to leave that occupation, he wanted to be covered also again by conscientious objection. At work, for a time, he did have some critical comments from workmates, and it may be true, you'd never know, but it may be true that it disadvantaged him in his progress in the management of the coal mines. But as time went on, he got on in general very well with the rest of the people that were working for him and the other miners and the rest of the workmen there. And I suppose 4 or 5 years it took, and from that time it didn't seem to make any difference to their relationship with him. He got on very well from that time, but during that period of the publicity in the newspapers, he had a difficult, I suppose, 12 or 18 months. Yes, I was about 10. I suppose it was hard for me to know because in the coal mining area, we all lived, the miners and all the different people working in the mine, and Dad was in the management, and that tended to separate people. You know, the people were very much more, I suspect, socially conscious than they were then, and it was just as much significant, I think, from the people who were lower down in the level, in the management level, that they were conscious that you didn't really make contact with the others except at work. In terms of the effect on them themselves, other than these critical comments, I don't remember Mum ever mentioning anything about it making any difference to the social contacts with other people. The Ecclesia was very small, and I suppose it would be only those in the immediate environment once the newspaper 9-Day Wonder had gone that would know anything about it. The only comments that I can remember her making was that she thought he'd done the right thing in supporting being there with the other brethren, and she supported what he'd done. Other than that, it didn't seem, to my 10-year-old observation, to make very much difference, and by the time I'd got to 13 or 14, it seemed to have disappeared.
As the war progressed, the Christadelphians were in a difficult position because they would not accept non-combatant duties. After some interchange of communication between the Central Standing Committee, the representatives of the Christadelphians, and the government, the Standing Committee decided to enlist the assistance of Sydney solicitors Francis and Francis. The solicitors, as instructed by the Standing Committee, forwarded a most comprehensive letter to the Prime Minister, setting out in detail that given in the first letter from the Secretary of the Central Standing Committee, the Christadelphian historical position governing the American Civil War and World War I in the United Kingdom, that they were also able to draw on a legal precedent to enhance their position. In the conclusion of the presentation, Francis and Francis respectively asked the Prime Minister, the Right Honourable R.G. Menzies, to exempt the Christadelphians from liability to enlist upon the proof furnished by the Standing Committee or any duly accredited representative of the Christadelphian fraternity that such persons are in fact members of the Ecclesia. It might be noted here, says the book on page 73, that one of the principals of Francis and Francis was a friend of the Prime Minister, and he used his good offices to make a personal plea to him to read the letter forwarded the previous day. Mr. Menzies responded courteously through his secretary. Sister Dot Barton shares her experiences.
Ron left the Education Department before we married and took up a position as draftsman and designer with an engineering firm. He stayed about a year, but with war was imminent, he applied to go back to the Education Department because he thought the engineering firm might be taken over by the military. He was now in a protected industry, but he's still registered as a conscientious objector. When he was called up to the court, we were living at Sherwood, where he was brought up and attended school, and so everybody, the young people there, still knew him. In court, he stated his objections to military service from a scriptural viewpoint. even though that wasn't put in the press that way. He saw the barrister as he passed his room during the lunch break, turning over the pages in the Bible, and immediately on returning, this barrister quoted scripture which he thought turned the tables his way. When Ron asked him to read the next few verses, he refused and said, "No, you answer that." The judge intervened and said, "Read on," whereupon he closed the book and sat down. I was not able to be present as I had 2 babies at home. Brother J.B. Watson always attended the court to support our young brothers. Ron was accused of teaching students how to make bullets, etc., which he of course denied. He was asked such questions as would he kill a mosquito, and when he said they were a pest, suggested the Japs were also a pest. Would he fight a Jap who attacked his wife? He answered he would, but protect her with his own body if necessary. One letter was sent to us telling him that he should have been thrown to the lions. The week after the trial, the photo of him was in the Truth, a paper Christadelphian would not normally buy. When he walked into the classroom at college, the page was taken out of the paper and pinned to the board. He just removed it and wrote up the lesson. At home one night while Ron was at work, our roof was pelted with pieces of galvanised iron, making a terrible din. Because Ron taught at night, he decided he wouldn't leave me there and we were going to shift. Houses were not easy to find, and my sister said there was one to rent at Moggill where we shifted. Public transport was not convenient, so Ron rode a bike each day to Taringa. This was a very long ride along dirt roads until the end of 1942. I was expecting our 3rd child in January 43. Ron took very ill and was in hospital for 3 weeks isolated with scarlet fever. The 2 boys, 2 and 1, had a light dose and I cared for them at home. My brother-in-law, Frank Twine, came down each night with his car, staying the night in case I needed to go to hospital. Roadworks were in front of our house, putting in a pipeline to Mount Crosby, and the men there were very kind. One came in one day and killed a black snake for me, which had invaded my kitchen. Ron arrived back from hospital just before Christmas, and we received a transfer to Mackay College in the new year. I think they thought they'd send us up closer to the action. We were fortunate to have the Smith family living in Mackay, where we held our memorial meetings on Sunday. We had problems. I had a girlfriend from school, and when she saw me coming, she'd cross the road. Wouldn't speak. People did those sort of things, sent letters, One of the letters that we received said, "Those who have sacrificed their blood to keep your thick hide safe would love to throw you and the Japs and the Nazis where you belong. Blah, blah won't always save you, your worthless hide, neither will J.C., of course, Jesus Christ. Nothing will convince others that you are anything but yellow." Well, we didn't get a lot of letters like that, but the people next door to my mother, there was a letter, a note put on the fence, just saying what they thought of us. But really, we were very blessed.
The correspondence between the Christadelphians via Francis and the government continued. In February 1940, Francis wrote a very detailed letter to the Minister for the Army, summarising the problems and using many arguments to try and convince the Minister that the Christadelphians had a justifiable claim to be granted total exemption on the basis of conscience. That detailed letter can be seen in the book. A further 2 letters from Francis asking for a response were forwarded to the Minister, one expressing concern that the receipt of the letter had not been acknowledged. Eventually, the Minister responded indicating that the matter was under consideration. A significant response, together with apologies, was given by the Minister for the Army in March 1940. He quoted extensively from the Prime Minister's response to a deputation of the people who had met him on the same issue. When the Prime Minister, R.G. Menzies, said in effect was that if some men had to go to prison for their conscience's sake, so be it. It would be a price the minority in the community might need to pay for the good of the majority. Sister Hazel Rendell shares her experiences.
Well, as I I've come into it as the war finished, but he has told me of going to the court and the magistrate and all the other brethren with him, but he was in for 2 years. This magistrate or judge had lost 2 sons in the Air Force, and he was very hard on this lot going through. But he didn't dwell on that, just that he was, there was things put in the paper that weren't correct, that weren't as they said. And he was just told to go home and pack his bag and be up at Awabba, I think, or up in the Coorambongs anyway. He was there 2 years, and he said it was a very good experience of working. He could have got out earlier. His father could have got him out because of being in the building game. But he stayed in the 2 years, and he spoke about the Dorcas sisters at Hurstville, how good they were. They made them, the boys from Hurstville, 2 pair of lovely thick flannelette pyjamas for them to take up there, because it was very cold in the winter time. There was Ron Buchan and Roy, I think, from Hurstville, and Bert Russell. Bill Drake, I think he was Hurstville at that time, and Jimmy McClure, who was an unbaptised, he wasn't 21 years old, and he went through the courts, and I admired him for doing that, for standing up for his principles, even though he wasn't baptised. But he was baptised later on. All the different religions up there would, they'd have discussions around and got to know one another. And even many, many years later, 35 years later, he would talk about the overseer there, and he must have been a forestry man, I think, but he respected them, and I think they were a group of brethren that could show by the life they lived their convictions. He had a rough time, I know, with his family, because he wouldn't join up, because his family weren't in the truth. His mother more so would ridicule. His dad wasn't so bad. His dad respected what he wanted to do, but his mother and some of the people around. And of course he'd only been in the truth 3 years, I think, before all the war started, if that. A white feather, in an envelope was given to him by, whether it was neighbours that probably had, their sons were in the army, whatever. And that, was a bit disturbing for the family. And he had younger brothers. But it still didn't alter how they felt, how he believed.